Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Baugh, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The title to today's program is Designer Genes. Now, that creates tremendous illusions and considerations of the mind. For instance, we are standing in an incredibly gorgeous replication of the Palace of Shushan, Ahasuerus Palace, and it certainly was designed. Even the replication was designed so that the roof fits, the columns fit, and if we want to move something over, everything has to be able to support the entire matrix and construct of the total design feature. But this marvelous and spectacular replication of Shushan Palace is nothing compared to the design within your human body. And within every cell of your body, you have the DNA in the nucleus, the deoxyribonucleic acid, and that little tiny information library does incredibly wonderful things. Designer genes are in vogue, and I've brought today to the studio a dear friend of mine, Professor John Hefner, well qualified to discuss this issue. Professor, it's always a privilege to have you on the program.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
You've been here many, many times.
Quite a few.
And you have almost 40 years, almost 4 decades as a career specialist in mathematics.
Yes.
You teach pre-calculus, trigonometry, and all the nice things that give unique direction and confluence, not only unique direction, but confluence to constructs. And that's what we're going to talk about today in genes. When I first heard you talk about designer genes, I thought you were talking about the fashion genes that our teens are involved with.
Well, I did a play on words, you know. Designer genes is on a lot of people's mind, but I'm going to spell it with a G.
Rather than a J. All right. Isn't this, now we talk about designer genes that are quite simplistic but necessary, designer genes for the fashion market, for clothing. Neat idea. But incredibly simplistic compared to the designer genes in our bodies and in the nucleus of the cell of all living systems. 4 basic little elemental particles that can be separated so that you can form a second replication. In fact, you and I started as one cell.
Yeah.
But in that cell was all the information necessary to replicate and program eyes, hair, ears, nose, feet, toenails, teeth, everything. What an incredibly beautiful concept.
It is.
I wonder who thought of that.
Oh, well, I think I have an idea.
Well, yes. Oh, yes. There had to be a designer for all of that.
Yes.
And aren't you glad it didn't have to experiment so we would have an arm running out our back for a while?
Oh, yeah.
And then he would decide, that won't work, so give him 3 feet instead. Well, that won't work. Instead, the design, even of the human locomotion you and I will use on the set today, that design to swing in perfect balance on a pelvic structure is all encoded within those designer genes.
Oh, it's an unbelievable litany of features that have to be, have instructions for that to occur.
Yes, and all has to work simultaneously.
And it's interesting, no one would suggest that designer blue jeans just happen by the wind blowing across a cotton field and the fibers hanging up on a barbed wire fence and weaving into fabric that is fashionable. No one would believe that. And yet some are willing to maintain that something far more complex and functional,
infinitely more complex,
just happened by chance, time and chance, and, you know, beneficial mutations, which are really birth defects.
Sure. Foolish, very foolish philosophic approach to how we got here and who we are. And the brain itself, along with all of these other features, all involved in the designer genes. All right, take us on the road. I want to hear what we have to learn today.
Well, first I thought it would be appropriate to just cut some ads of blue jeans out and put the little play on words, designer genes.
Sure.
But just a quick little brief history. In 2001, the human genome was found to be far more complex than previously thought. Scientists, in fact, are amazed that the human genome was reported to only have about 35,000 genes. Now, previous estimates were 4 times as much as that, 140,000 genes.
And our first thinking was, well,
Yes.
wait a minute, it's not quite as complex as we thought.
Yeah, so at first thought, we think, well, you know, we're not as complex as we thought we were. We only have 35,000 genes. Well, but actually this vastly lower number means that the human genome is more complex.
Yes.
Because these genes can be read forward and backward and even three-dimensionally.
And the so-called junk DNA
Oh, yeah.
responds to unique environmental context. This is an incredibly complex and incredibly beautiful design for living systems.
That's true. And in fact, in 2004, the International Human Genome Sequencing Consortium, it's a long mouthful of words, but they reduced it down to about 25,000 genes. And
That means they're more complicated.
Yes, and they said, and their quote is, "It blows our socks off," as reported in Nature magazine back in 2004. "We have a long way to go to understand how all the parts revealed by the genome sequence together to make life." And what we're finding is that these things are obviously multitasking.
So they're much more complicated than we had originally thought.
That's right, and they are read, like it says, forward and backward and three-dimensionally. I think of it as like a notebook of transparencies with words written on the transparencies, but as you read down vertically through the stack of clear transparency sheets, what if the letters stacked up made words and meanings being read both ways and backwards and forwards and up and down and all of that? And that's probably a pretty close analogy of what we actually find
Beautiful analogy, yes.
in the human genome. Well, we've all got our own set of designer genes. That's the point you made so well. An example of multitasking genes, which we're discussing, University...
Now let's pause for a moment.
Okay.
Let's define genes, Professor. What are we talking about?
Well, I have a little thing coming up that's going to kind of make an analogy with letters,
the audience, yes,
words,
let
and
us know.
sentences.
Sure, what the genes actually are.
And I've got that coming up, but just suffice it to say it's a complex little piece of information that carries out a function. And for example, the CX26, which is a gene associated with deafness or hearing, get this, also plays a role in helping wounds to heal.
Now that's incredible.
Seemingly unrelated features, but again, a multitasking gene.
And depending on how it's read forward, backward, or three-dimensionally.
Evidently.
Yes.
And this is their report. I just know what I read in the paper, you know.
Yeah.
It's impossible to know the precise value of a gene. There's value in assuming that inconvenient but survivable genes might be there for a reason.
Oh,
as reported by Discover magazine. Now, in complete honesty, they mean there for an evolutionary reason, but we think there's a reason, all right, but it's a design feature.
It's a design feature.
Rather than some accidental feature. Now, a question you just raised is about junk DNA. And here's the answer about so-called junk DNA. It's possible that non-coding DNA contains signals that decide when other genes are switched on or off. They're not necessarily always on, as reported by Science News back in December of 2005.
And this audience needs to know that between Science, and Science News repeats it from Science, between Science magazine and Nature magazine, we have the world's 2 most prestigious scientific journals. So this is not simply an afterthought of some incidental scholar. These are major statements by major microbiologists and biochemists.
That's right. And the non-coding region of the genome, once known dismissively as junk DNA, is crucial, as reported in Time magazine in 2006.
That's a major statement.
It's major because they wanted to, it seems like they did, to dismiss all of that to junk DNA that was reflective of our evolutionary history.
Yes.
And relegated to some, you know, forgotten warehouse somewhere in the body. Yes. In essence.
The idea, as you said, was that in our evolutionary history, we accumulated a lot of genes, a lot of junk that we don't need, a lot of glob that we just really don't need.
And